Hassan, how angry are you? I'm pretty angry, and I'm betting you are too. Congressional leaders are expected tonight to finally agree to a new COVID relief bill worth $900 billion. But the number to keep your eye on is $600. That's $600. The amount that individual Americans making $75K or less can expect in one-time direct relief. Checks that could go out as soon as next week, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. It's half the amount Americans got when Congress passed the CARES Act 9 months ago. $600 per person. But of course, leaders from both parties are spinning this as a positive outcome.
We can finally report what our nation has needed to hear for a very long time. More help is on the way.
It is a strong shot in the arm to help American families weather the storm.
We also have in the legislation direct payments, which were not in the Republican bill, to America's working families. I would like them been bigger, but they are significant.
A strong shot in the arm, says Schumer. Significant, says Pelosi. The same Pelosi who's believed to be worth tens of millions of dollars. $600? Significant? Are you kidding me? On average, American households spend about $680 a month on food, just over $1,000 a month for shelter, and for those lucky enough to have health insurance, that's $300 a month on average. That's all according to the latest available data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which again is an average. So if you live in a big city, your costs are likely much higher than that. In fact, a Business Insider analysis finds that $600 in a major city would last 6 to 11 days. And this is a one-off check. Let me say this again. After 9 months of suffering, the US government decided to spot you for one whole week or so. Forgive us for not groveling with gratitude. Here's what else is in the $900 billion deal. Up to $600 per child, enhanced unemployment benefits of $300 a week. That is also half of what the CARES Act provided. And get this, 100% tax write-off for the cost of business meals, referred to by critics as the 3-martini lunch. There's money for that. According to the Washington Post, Democratic leaders agreed to the provision in exchange for Republicans agreeing to expand tax credits for low-income families and the working poor. You can see where each party's priorities lie, to be fair. But it didn't have to be like this. The House passed the HEROES Act with $1,200 direct checks in May and then an updated version in October. Mitch McConnell never brought it to the Senate floor. In April, Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna and Tim Ryan introduced a bill to give Americans $2,000 a month for up to 12 months through the pandemic. That bill went nowhere. On the Senate side, an unlikely duo, Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley, put forth a standalone bill for $1,200 checks just last week that was rejected by, among others, GOP Senator Ron Johnson, twice in his case.
I'm not heartless. I want to help people. I voted to help people. I voted for the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, but I also am concerned about our children's future and the fact that we are mortgaging it. We do not have an unlimited checking account. We have to be concerned about these things.
I'm not heartless, says heartless GOP senator. Funny how he wasn't concerned when he voted for Trump's trillion-dollar tax cuts. He wasn't concerned about the deficit then. But I digress. Even President Trump reportedly wanted to go big on relief checks, up to $2,000 apparently, until White House aides talked him out of it, according to the Washington Post. So we somehow can only afford half of what Americans got in the last relief bill, even as coronavirus cases spike. But guess what we do have money for? War. Earlier this month, the House and Senate passed the annual defense spending bill, giving the Pentagon $740 billion with a veto-proof majority. That breaks down to roughly $2 billion per day in Pentagon spending. Guess who voted for that? our friends Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and yes, fair weather deficit hawk Ron Johnson. Senator Bernie Sanders voted against the defense bill and called out his Republican and Democratic colleagues on Twitter, saying the same centrists who tell us we cannot afford to give the working class and seniors a direct payment to pay the rent and feed their families during a pandemic all voted to give the bloated Pentagon a record $740 billion without paying for it. Unacceptable, he said. So there you have it, $2 billion every day for the military. A one-time $600 check for you, America, richest country in the history of the world. Joining me now is economist and former Labour Secretary under Bill Clinton, Professor Robert Reich. Robert, thanks so much for coming back on the show. We always have so much money for killing people abroad and so little money for saving people here at home.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, Brady? I mean, not only is it extraordinary in normal circumstances, but we're not in normal circumstances. We are in a national emergency. Even if the vaccines get out as quickly as people hope, it's still going to be 3 or 4 months. How are people possibly going to survive on $600 over the next 3 or 4 months? I don't know. I don't understand the mathematics. And yet we are, as a nation, able to afford $740 billion for the military for just 1 year. We are able, as a nation, to afford a true $1 trillion tax cut for the wealthy and for big corporations. I mean, the priorities are bizarre. I don't, you said at the start of this segment that you were angry. I think that everybody has a right to be upset, at least upset about what is going on and why the priorities are being set as they are.
Yeah. And I'm angry about the fact that we reached this point, even though it was predicted and predictable. But to be fair, I want to be fair, Robert, let's look at some of the other parts of this bill, because there are some good parts in there. $284 billion in PPP loans for businesses, small businesses, $82 billion for colleges and schools, $69 billion for vaccine distribution and testing, $25 billion in rental assistance, and an extension for the federal eviction moratorium. So, putting aside the failure to support individuals with direct payments, what is your overall assessment of this deal? Because it stands at, what, $900 billion? Most economists, correct me if I'm wrong, wanted $2 trillion on some of that stuff I just mentioned.
I think $2 trillion would have been appropriate given the size of the problems we are dealing with, given the survival needs of Americans. Now, some people might say, well, $900 billion it's not $2 trillion, but it's better than nothing. Obviously, it is better than nothing. $100 would have been better than nothing. Yeah. Again, where I get hung up on is the size of the problem and emergency we are facing. The fact that there is a 3-martini business lunch tax deduction built in here just adds insult to injury. Now, I don't want to engage in nefarious kind of equalizing between the parties, because the parties actually did take different positions. The Republicans really are the party of business and big corporations and Wall Street. And in fairness, the Democrats really did try to come out with something that would help average working people and the poor. But this kind of compromise ends up being so much less adequate than we need as a country that we can't simply say better than nothing and end the conversation there.
Yes, indeed. And just talking about the Democratic Party splits over the priorities in this bill, Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's on the right of the party, said on CNN on Friday that unemployment was the bigger emergency and more of a priority for him than direct checks. He thinks direct checks can wait. Bernie Sanders on the left was pushing harder for direct checks, for bigger amounts in those checks. Where do you stand on this debate between universal relief, checks for everybody, getting money to everybody fast, or more targeted relief for those who need it most?
Well, if it's got to be one or the other, I would say targeted relief is better, particularly on unemployment. We know that those extra $600 a week we had from the spring did a great deal for people who were unemployed or nearly unemployed, or people who became unemployed or lost their jobs and actually stopped being in the labor market altogether. Those unemployment checks were critically important, and now they've been cut in half. Instead of $600 a week extra unemployment, there is $300 extra unemployment, and it only lasts for 11 weeks. I mean, again, I'm laughing because of the absurdity of this. You don't have vaccines. Indeed. Are not going to be universally available in 11 weeks.
Yeah. And that was the argument that was made by the Democratic leadership. And interestingly, you mentioned just a moment ago that, you know, if it has to be one or the other, you'd go targeted. The problem, of course, as you well know, it doesn't have to be one or the other. America can afford to do both, but chooses not to. And let's just talk about some of the negotiations that got us to this point. In May, the House passed a $3 trillion HEROES Act, then repassed it at about $2.2 trillion, came down by $1 trillion or more in early October. That was followed up by a $1.8 trillion offer from the Trump White House. And now we have this $900 billion compromise, which you rightly call an inadequate compromise. At the head of all this for the Democrats was Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who just dropped most of her demands at every turn without really getting much in return. She dropped from 3 to 2 to less than $1 trillion. What do you make of her handling of these negotiations? How were they not anything other than an utter failure, Robert?
Well, the question really, from a political bargaining standpoint, is how much the Democrats had in terms of ammunition. How well, you know, what would be the cost to Democrats if there were no bargain? And the cost would have been very, very great in terms of people who would be hungry, people who would be without any help whatsoever. What's the cost to the Republicans with no agreement? The only thing Mitch McConnell was really concerned about was January 5th, the Georgia runoff elections. He didn't want those two Republican candidates to go into those Georgia runoff elections and have to sort of apologize for the Republicans who came up with absolutely zero. So what Mitch McConnell obviously did is he said, what's the minimal possible amount we can provide so that those two runoff candidates in Georgia will not be embarrassed, won't lose votes. That was the calculation. Again, I mean, what else did the Democrats have going into those negotiations? Joe Biden was a little bit of a bystander. Donald Trump was completely out of it. I mean, Donald Trump, as far as I can see and understand, Donald Trump is not participating in any negotiations in anything that has to do with governing. All he's doing is worrying about how he can get to be president again, which is absurd.
Yeah, indeed. And when you look at, you mentioned Mitch McConnell, but I mean, it's hard to see this as anything other than a win for McConnell, who went from $500 billion was his opening offer, and now he's agreed tonight to $900 billion, whereas Nancy Pelosi came down, as I say, from over $3 trillion. McConnell, is ultimately the architect of all this suffering, even more so than Donald Trump in many ways. He wouldn't agree to this deal before the election. He's only agreed to $900 billion now, when, as we say, most economists agree $2 trillion is what's necessary. Joe Biden and him have been friendly in the past. Do you think President Biden can convince Senate Majority Leader McConnell, assuming they win the Georgia races, to do more relief in the new year? I don't see it. I see Mitch wanting to cripple a Biden presidency, even if that means throwing tens of millions of more Americans under the bus.
I think you're absolutely right. And if Joe Biden thinks that somehow Mitch McConnell is going to be his friend when Joe Biden becomes president, and Mitch McConnell is still, if Mitch McConnell is still the majority leader, that's just delusional thinking. Mitch McConnell has shown right from when he became the majority leader that he is going to do everything he can in a very partisan way to make life difficult for every Democrat and to simply accumulate more and more power. This is what this man is all about. He really doesn't care about this country. He cares about partisan advantage. He's done this all the way through with the Obama administration. I think this is why January 5th becomes so critically important, because if those runoffs do provide the possibility that Kamala Harris cast the deciding vote in the Senate, because it's a tie between Republicans and Democrats, it's going to make a world of difference. Otherwise, Mitch McConnell is going to play obstructionism, and the entire Biden administration turns on what Biden can do without Congress, through executive orders and through regulation.
Yes. And, of course, what's fascinating is you talk about him pushing for partisan advantage. McConnell doesn't even seem to care about unemployed Republican voters in Kentucky who are hurting and who would benefit from a better deal. Doesn't seem to care about them either. Robert, you tweeted a rather pointed comparison of what other countries are doing in terms of COVID relief. You tweeted Japan is paying up to 200% of wages, Netherlands and Norway up to 90%, Canada is paying 75%, and the US, big fat zero. And yet, even when Donald Trump apparently tried to offer bigger checks, more money, his aides, according to the Washington Post, talked Trump out of it. Republicans wouldn't talk him out of caging kids at the border or praising neo-Nazis at Charlottesville or turning a blind eye to COVID. But money for ordinary Americans, that they talk him out of.
And this is where it's very, very important to keep an eye on where the money actually flows. Follow the money. I mean, the Republican Party is as dependent as ever on big money, corporate money, money from Wall Street, money from traditional Republican backers who don't want higher taxes. They don't want higher deficits because they're afraid that higher deficits mean higher taxes. They want to keep the stock market high. That's their only interest. That's Donald Trump's only interest. And so when it comes to working people, average working people, poor people, people who are desperate, people who have fallen from the middle class into the working class or nearly into poverty, the Republican Party, their rhetoric is nice, but they don't want to do anything. Again and again, they don't want to do anything for average people.
Absolutely. One last quick question for you. You tweeted this in June. I have held off using the F word for 3.5 years, but there is no longer any honest alternative. Trump is a fascist, and he's promoting fascism in America. People like me, Robert, who've been calling him a fascist for years, we were told we were being alarmist. Now the argument seems to be, well, our institutions held up. We're fine. Trump will be coming on January 20th. I mean, we may not be so lucky when another Trump comes along.
No, I think we dodged a bullet, really. We have a reprieve right now. And the question is, over the next 4 years of the Biden administration, and hopefully there will be more than 4 years of a Democratic, maybe a Biden administration, certainly a Democratic administration, hopefully, what can we do to get this nation back on track so that we do not have to face the equivalent of Donald Trump as far as the eye can see? Because as long as most Americans, and this has been the case for 40 years, most Americans' wages, adjusted for inflation, are going nowhere. And they trust government less and less. And they feel like the whole game is rigged against them. In many respects, it is. Then we are going to be issuing a kind of ongoing invitation for demagogues to come along and persuade people that their real enemies are foreigners, are immigrants, are black people, are brown people, or there's a conspiracy against them. And so what we have right now is a period of time in which we can try, we the people in this country can try to get back on track, to try to make this country a place where everybody has a stake, where everybody can get ahead, where everybody can, through hard work, really achieve the American dream. If we don't do that, that's the danger. If we don't do that, then
it is indeed.
I don't think it's going to be Donald Trump himself, but there will be Donald Trumps out there.
Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of The Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.